The quiet Christchurch suburb was shaken on the night of May 3, 2009. Inside a small, one-story house, a tragic scene was unfolding. Philip Nisbet, a loving father and truck driver, was found lying lifeless on his bed, his eyes open but unseeing. His wife, Helen Milner, stood nearby, holding a phone and crying as she told the police that her husband had taken his own life. The initial shock of Phil's sudden death deeply affected their family and friends, but as they grieved, doubts and suspicions started to arise. Helen Milner was born around 1964 in New Zealand to Anne Milner. Anne often shared how challenging it was to raise Helen, who was a difficult child from a young age. By the age of 10, Helen had already begun causing serious trouble, a pattern that continued throughout her life. Anne kept a list documenting Helen's misdeeds, which included serious incidents. Helen attended high school in Christchurch, the largest city on New Zealand's South Island, known for its English heritage. Despite being in a reputable school, Helen engaged in theft from her classmates and withdrew substantial sums of money from her mother's bank account. Although her mother decided against pressing charges and her peers did not report her to the authorities, the school eventually expelled her. Concerned about her future, her mother enrolled her in Ritchie Secretarial College. After graduating, Helen worked as a typist but was dismissed after presenting a falsified letter from the Ministry of Health, which supposedly allowed smoking in the staff room. She then took a job as a cashier at United Building Society, a New Zealand construction society, but was fired for stealing money. Once again, her mother covered the stolen amount and spent thousands to keep her out of court and prison. Despite these efforts, Helen continued on a troubled path. She had moved to Wellington with a fiancé, but the relationship ended badly, leaving her in debt and returning to Christchurch. Money remained an issue. Helen often took advantage of her family, stealing from her disabled aunt and her father's wallet. In her early 20s, Helen met Mark Robert Kearns and they married around 1987, having 2 sons, Greg and Adam. Their marriage ended in a bitter divorce in the mid-1990s, marked by a fierce custody battle. According to Mark, Helen was manipulative and motivated by money or personal gain, showing no empathy. She allegedly lied in family court to gain custody and told the children that their father had moved to Australia and did not want to see them. Despite spending over $20,000 on lawyers, Mark struggled to maintain contact with his children until they were old enough to visit him independently, by which time their relationship was severely strained. Details of Helen's life after the divorce are unclear until 2005 when she married Philip Nisbet. Phil was born on March 20th, 1962. He was the eldest of 4 siblings. As the eldest, Phil was always protective and caring towards his siblings, especially his youngest sister. At some point, the Nisbets moved to Australia, but Phil chose to stay in New Zealand. He worked as a truck driver, a demanding but reasonably well-paid job. He was married to a woman named Vicky, with whom he had his eldest son, Zach. After their separation, he formed a relationship with Karen, which produced his younger son, Ben. This relationship also ended, leaving Phil single again as he entered his 40s. The specifics of how Phil and Helen met remain unclear, but it is evident that both had experienced failed marriages and had children from previous relationships. Their happiness together was well documented in family photos shared on social media, showing them smiling and evidently in love. They got married in 2005. Initially, everything seemed perfect, and their families were pleased to see them rebuilding their lives. However, not everything was flawless, and like any couple, they had their difficulties. Even Helen's family blamed her for generating conflicts, as Phil avoided confrontations. Helen and her sister-in-law, Lee Ann, had a falling out in 2006, leading to a permanent rift. There are two versions of the story behind their disagreement. One version suggests that Lee Ann's teenage son, Lance, had stayed with Phil and Helen, and after an incident that upset Helen, she called her sister-in-law to complain, resulting in an argument. The other version claims that Lance reported to his mother about a nefarious plan that his Uncle Phil was allegedly plotting under Helen's influence to harm his ex-partner Karen. Lee Ann confronted Phil about the absurd plan and took her son out of Phil's house. Despite this, Lee Ann continued to love her brother but regretted the distance that grew between them. Although things seemed fine, or at least Phil thought so, Helen had grown tired of the relationship. She spoke ill of him behind his back and complained about not being free. Sometimes she openly fantasized in front of her co-workers about becoming a widow. However, she never mentioned divorce. On April 15, 2009, Phil fainted at work and was taken to the hospital. Doctors were unsure of the cause but suspected an allergic reaction to a spider or insect bite during a recent visit to Australia for his birthday. His condition improved and he was sent home, but that night, he fell ill again. Helen informed her younger son that she would take Phil back to the hospital. In the days that followed, Adam spoke to Phil about something odd he had noticed the night Phil's condition worsened. He told Phil that his mother had been holding some empty capsules and tried to hide them from view. Despite being Helen's son, Adam warned his stepfather to be cautious, suggesting that his mother might poison him. Phil, trusting and unwilling to believe such a thing, reassured Adam that he had nothing to worry about and must have been mistaken. This incident was the final straw for Adam, who moved out the next day, unwilling to remain in a toxic environment. For about 3 weeks, life returned to normal, with everyone going about their routines without health issues. On May 3, 2009, Phil, a loving father, texted his younger son Ben before bed, informing him that he had washed his hoodie and would bring it to him the next day. However, Phil did not wake up that morning. On May 4, 2009, Helen called the police, reporting that her husband Phil was dead in their home. The police responded quickly as it was a slow day with an available patrol. Helen, in tears, opened the door and led the officers to the master bedroom, where they found Phil's body lying diagonally on the bed, eyes open and not breathing. The officers noticed 2 empty packets of pills and a half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. Helen's crying intensified, but something about her made the officers keep their distance. They called their superiors to report the scene and notify Phil's family. With the phone in her hand, Helen reported that her husband had taken his own life and that she had evidence to prove it. The police took the phone and saw a message on the screen, seemingly sent by Phil. The message expressed Phil's sorrow, stating he couldn't go on, that he loved her very much, and asked her to take care of herself and tell Ben that he loved him. The message was dated May 3rd and sent at 10:30 p.m. The lead officer on the scene was notified of everything that transpired during their investigation. Meanwhile, Phil's body was taken to the morgue in hopes that the autopsy would shed light on the situation. Leigh Ann described the moment she received the call from her father, informing her that Phil had ended his life, as terrible. Despite not speaking to her brother much over the past 2 years due to her argument with Helen, she never imagined Phil would make such a drastic decision. Days later, when the preliminary autopsy report was released, it was revealed that Phil's body contained high levels of an anti-allergic drug that paradoxically caused him a severe allergic reaction. At that moment, Leigh Ann felt she had to accept that her brother had decided to end it all, but something in her spirit rebelled against this notion. From then on, significant events unfolded, but the police seemed fixated on the idea that Phil's death was self-inflicted, causing delays in the investigation. Then, something almost unheard of in criminal cases occurred. The perpetrator's own family accused her. On May 13th, the couple's relatives went to the police station. They expressed their suspicions that Helen had tried to kill her husband 3 weeks before the fatal outcome. However, this lead was not immediately pursued. Another notable event was that during May, Helen began exchanging text messages with an ex-boyfriend named Barry. Surprisingly, Barry moved into the home Helen and her recently deceased husband had shared just a few weeks later. By this time, Leigh Ann had re-established contact with Helen, as Phil's death necessitated conversations and reconciliation. In one of their talks, Helen mentioned a farewell letter that Phil had left, which she found when she opened the safe. She read the letter and promised to show it to Leigh Ann when they met in person. A little over a month after her brother's death, Leigh Ann flew from Australia to New Zealand for 2 reasons. One was to celebrate her son's 21st birthday, and the other was to discreetly investigate Phil's death. Helen offered her a place to stay, and she accepted. The night of her arrival, Helen greeted her with a vodka glass in one hand and the supposed farewell note in the other, typed on office paper and signed with "Phil" scribbled at the bottom. Leigh Ann immediately thought it didn't look like her brother's signature but remained silent, focusing on the letter's content. Phil claimed he had discovered that Ben was not his biological son and could not face him again. Additionally, Helen mentioned finding a small black book Phil supposedly kept, detailing affairs with other women and a guide on becoming a gigolo. Though angered by the negative image Helen was trying to paint of her brother, Leigh Ann had to pretend not to arouse suspicion. She said she disapproved of Phil's decision to take his own life and would go to bed to be in good condition for the next day when the family would gather at a restaurant to celebrate Lance's 21st birthday. That day when Helen returned from work, she was furious, carrying the mail in her hand. Karen, Ben's mother, had written to request Ben's belongings from the house and some money Phil had left for his younger son. Filled with rage, Helen declared she would put Karen in her place, claiming Ben wasn't Phil's son and announcing that they would not be attending Lance's birthday celebration. Although Leigh Ann disagreed with Helen's behavior, she chose to remain silent, not wanting to provoke her. She needed to stay close and observe everything she could, as she continued to suspect foul play in her brother's death. That evening, Barry, Helen's new boyfriend, dropped off the 2 women at the restaurant where they would celebrate Lance's birthday. Upon arriving, they met Zach, Phil's eldest son, who was with Vicky, his mother, and her partner. Helen was extremely courteous to them, even inviting Zach to her house the following weekend to sort through his father's belongings and take what he wanted. Leigh Ann later remarked that she could hardly focus on Lance's celebration with everything happening before her eyes. She couldn't understand why Ben was treated so poorly while Zach was offered his father's possessions. It also struck her as odd that Ben was mentioned in Phil's last messages, but Zach was not. She suspected that Phil had not taken his own life and that Helen had written the notes to sow discord between the brothers, but she couldn't prove it. Before returning to Australia, Leanne went to the police and provided all this information. She found it suspicious that Helen was already living with her new boyfriend in the house she had shared with Phil. Following the accusations from Helen's own family and Leanne's statements, the police requested Helen to provide the supposed farewell note from her husband. She submitted it on July 6, 2009, but notably, Phil's scrawled signature was missing. Meanwhile, Helen's relationship with Barry was progressing rapidly. On July 12, 2009, he gifted her a gold ring with a diamond worth over $2,000. Helen wore it proudly on her ring finger but insisted it was not an engagement ring, as Barry had not proposed when he gave it to her. Throughout 2009, Helen continued her deceitful ways. Between January and September, she had been stealing from her employer, although no one knew at the time. At the beginning of 2010, amid multiple requests from Phil's family to clarify the circumstances of his death, the police summoned Helen for another statement. On January 30th, she made her second statement, and by then, her depiction of an ideal marriage from her first interview had changed significantly. She told the detective that she never claimed her husband was a good man. When asked about the note explaining his decision, she stated that the police had found it in his briefcase and that the handwritten signature resembled Phil's writing. The investigator reminded her that the letter she submitted to the station had no signature. Helen quickly responded that she had kept a copy and hadn't looked at it for so long that she mistakenly believed it was signed. Helen also expressed that Phil's family had turned against her, claiming it was unfair. Known for her vengeful nature, in March 2010, she bought a mobile phone and sent herself threatening messages, pretending they were from her son Adam. This was her way of retaliating after learning he had backed his grandmother when alerting the police about how dangerous Helen could be. She accused Adam of sending death threats to his ex-girlfriend, suggesting he had violated a restraining order, and claimed he was extremely aggressive, making her fear for her safety. Due to these serious allegations from his mother, Adam was detained for over 15 days until it was revealed that everything was a fabrication of Helen's twisted mind. Helen's luck seemed to turn in late 2010. In October, she was sentenced to 5 months of house arrest after being found guilty of stealing from her employer between January and September 2009. Concurrently, Leanne's persistence bore fruit, leading to a forensic investigation into Phil's death starting in November 2010. Leanne had requested permission to review some evidence for the court case, and it was granted. Leanne brought a folder of documents with Phil's signature for comparison with the farewell letter. The judge showed her and her brother the letter. Leanne practically snatched it from the judge's hand upon seeing it lacked a signature, displaying her anger and disappointment at what she saw as another of Helen's attempts to evade responsibility. The subsequent court investigation highlighted the police's failings in investigating Phil's death, Helen's history of law violations, and mounting evidence that Phil had not taken his own life but was a victim of foul play. On the stand, Helen described her husband as very nervous and easily agitated, recounting their trip to Australia in March 2009 for Phil's birthday. During that trip, he had been bitten by an insect, taken a low dose of Phenergan, and remained unconscious for at least 6 hours, discovering his severe allergy to the medication. Helen added that the day before his death, they had a pleasant time shopping, having lunch and discussing future projects for the house. They had dinner, watched TV, and Phil showered and went to bed around 9:30 p.m. According to Helen, she joined him an hour later, kissed him goodnight, and went to sleep. The investigation in court lasted 6 months, with various pieces of evidence presented and thoroughly analyzed. On May 12, 2011, the judge presented her conclusions, stating there was insufficient evidence to prove Phil intended to take his own life. This conclusion paved the way for a homicide investigation. The investigators took an immediate interest in the case and launched a murder inquiry that lasted several months. On October 27, 2011, Helen was arrested and charged with murder and attempted murder. In the meantime, Helen continued facing legal repercussions for her other actions. In August 2012, she was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison for sending herself insulting text messages, pretending they were from her son. In March 2010, she was denied parole. The murder trial began on December 12, 2013. The Crown's prosecution spent 2 weeks presenting evidence from over 70 witnesses, asserting that Helen attempted to kill her husband twice, succeeding on the second attempt, using doses of the anti-allergy and sedative drug Phenergan. The motive was believed to be financial, as Helen intended to claim Phil's $250,000 life insurance policy. The financial advisor who sold the policy to the couple in 2008 testified that Phil was present when the policy was purchased, but he suspected Helen filled out the entire form on her husband's behalf. It was also revealed that the insurance policy had a 13-month exclusion clause for voluntary death, which expired in March 2009, just before Helen's alleged attempts on Phil's life. The Crown recounted Helen's purchase of the medication to which Phil was allergic, using false names and addresses. They suggested she mixed the drug into Phil's food and, after he was sedated, suffocated him. She then manipulated the scene, sending the fake farewell text and writing the typed note. A DNA test confirmed that the claim about Ben not being Phil's biological son was false. Colleagues of Helen testified that she frequently talked about poisons and her desire to suffocate her husband. A pivotal moment in the trial was Adam's testimony. He recalled visiting the police station with his grandmother on May 13, 2009, after Helen had expressed her desire to kill Phil and even suggested hiring a hitman. When Adam asked why she didn't divorce Phil instead, Helen responded that she didn't want to lose half of the house. Adam recounted seeing his mother in the kitchen on April 15, 2009, with 2 transparent capsules filled with a pale blue powder, which she nervously hid when he noticed. She claimed Phil had a headache. That night, Helen took Phil to the hospital, and the next day, Adam warned his stepfather about what he had seen, but Phil dismissed his concerns. The first officer on the scene noted that Helen's prolonged emotional display seemed unnatural. He and his colleague found it suspicious that the farewell text was discovered precisely when they were at the house. Helen's explanation that she stayed in bed with Phil until 2 a.m., then moved to the sofa after taking insulin, was also dubious, as Phil's body was positioned in a way that made it unlikely she had been beside him. Additionally, the farewell text was sent at 10:30 p.m., contradicting her timeline. In court, it was revealed that Helen's mother had written a letter requesting Helen's removal from her will and had accompanied Adam to the police to report Phil's suspected murder. Anne's letter stated that she finally faced the truth about her daughter, describing Helen as either mentally ill or simply evil. The defense maintained that Phil had taken his own life and argued that the Crown's case was based on orchestrated and arbitrary evidence. The Crown presented a circumstantial but solid case, while the defense lawyer warned against convicting Helen based on what he considered subjective evidence. The police admitted initial investigative failings, stating the case should have been treated as a homicide from the start. A jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for half a day before rejecting the defense's claim that Phil had taken his own life. They found Helen guilty of murder, but not guilty of attempted murder. Helen, then 50, reacted calmly as the jury delivered their verdict. In February 2014, the sentencing hearing for Helen took place at the Christchurch High Court. The judge addressed Helen directly, stating that she committed the crime purely for financial gain, and because she wanted to rid herself of a husband she no longer desired in her life. He added that her actions were even more reprehensible because Phil was an exceptionally kind man who had given her no reason to take his life. The judge agreed with the Crown's assertion that Helen's actions were calculated and cold, describing them as a meticulously planned and executed scheme with cruel disregard for Phil's family and friends. Ultimately, Helen was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 17 years before being eligible for parole, for causing Phil's death in 2009 to claim a $250,000 life insurance payout. One of the consequences of the trial was the tarnishing of the police's reputation for initially adhering to the idea of a self-inflicted fatal injury despite indicators of foul play. The media highlighted this issue, which the public deemed crucial. Reports revealed an internal document exposing fundamental flaws in the initial investigation. After the sentencing, Mark Kearns, Helen's first husband, broke his silence, stating that Helen nearly destroyed his relationship with their children. He said he was trying to rebuild his bond with Greg, 25, and Adam, 23, understanding the need to move past the past. Adam, who had filed a civil lawsuit against his mother for falsely accusing him of harassment, won the case in 2014. He argued that Helen's actions caused him pain, distress, humiliation, and financial loss due to his unjust 15-day imprisonment. Helen was ordered to pay Adam Kearns $55,000. However, Helen's impact on Adam's life led to further legal troubles. He faced charges for cannabis sale and illegal possession of a shotgun and appeared in the media for assaulting Justin Marshall, a former New Zealand Super Rugby champion from the early 2000s. Leanne's persistence ensured that Phil's murder did not go unpunished. After the intense legal battle, she, a single mother of 4 living in Australia, wrote a book about the case, published in 2016. By then, she had also started studying criminology and justice at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, hoping to work in the criminal justice system to improve the arduous and stressful path for other victims. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.